My brother took credit for my design and sold it to a firm for $1 million. He bought a sports car and laughed. I filed a patent infringement case. And yesterday, his sports car was towed from his driveway while he stood on the porch watching it go. That image, my brother standing on his porch in the specific posture of someone watching something they bought with someone else's money disappear into the back of a tow truck, is the last image in a story that starts 18 months earlier in a shared apartment in Chicago, where I was working 12-hour days on a product design that I believed in completely, and that I made the mistake of trusting my brother with before the paperwork was finished. The mistake was specific, and I want to name it clearly because it is the kind of mistake that smart people made constantly, and that the creative industries were full of the wreckage of. The mistake was trusting a relationship to protect something that only documentation could protect. The mistake was believing that blood meant the same thing as contract when it came to intellectual property. The mistake was showing my brother a design I had been building for 14 months before I had filed the provisional patent application that was sitting 90% complete on my laptop, because I had kept telling myself I would finish it this week, and then this week had not arrived yet. My brother finished his week faster than I finished my application. He presented the design to a firm called Halcyon Product Group in 3 meetings I did not know were happening. He signed a licensing agreement I did not know existed. He deposited $1 million into an account with his name on it. He drove a red Porsche 911 out of the dealership on a Thursday afternoon. And he called me on Friday morning to tell me what he had done. Not to confess, to explain why it was reasonable. He said the design had been a collaboration. He said my contribution had been the concept, and his contribution had been the market positioning and the client relationship, and that the market positioning and the client relationship were what the $1 million was actually paying for. He said I should be grateful that the design had found a home rather than sitting on my laptop indefinitely. He said he had planned to tell me before the deal closed, but the timeline had moved faster than expected. He said he would make it right when things settled. He said all of this in the specific calm voice of someone who had rehearsed the explanation and believed it was sufficient. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'll talk to you soon, Darius." I hung up. I opened my laptop. I finished the patent application. I filed it that afternoon as a provisional patent with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, with an attached document that included every version of the design from the earliest conceptual sketches through the final specification, time-stamped across 14 months of development in the cloud storage system, where I kept all of my work. 14 months of dated files establishing a creation timeline that predated every meeting my brother had taken with Halcyon. Then I called an intellectual property attorney named Sandra Reeves, whose card I had received at a design conference 18 months earlier, and whose name I had saved under the note, "If you ever need this." I needed this. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, ring that notification bell, and stay with me through every section of this story. Because what happened between the Friday phone call and the tow truck in the driveway took 18 months and involved a discovery process that produced things even I had not expected to find. My name is Zara Coleman, and I am 31 years old. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a house on the north side where my parents, Winston and Margaret Coleman, had raised me and my brother Darius in the specific combination of structure and warmth that produced children who understood both that expectations existed and that the expectations came from somewhere real. My father was an architect who had run a small residential architecture practice in Indianapolis for 30 years. My mother had been an interior designer for 25 years before transitioning into design education at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. The household I grew up in was saturated with design in the specific way of households where both parents worked in visual and spatial disciplines. There were drawings on every surface, conversations about proportion and material and function at the dinner table, and the specific ambient education that came from having parents who thought about the built environment professionally and talked about it constantly. I absorbed this completely. Darius absorbed it selectively. My brother was 4 years older than me and had the specific quality of someone who was intelligent in the social and strategic sense, and who had identified early that the intelligence he had was most useful when applied to understanding what other people wanted and giving them a version of it. He had been the popular one in school, the one who knew everyone and who moved between social groups with the ease of someone who understood that belonging was a skill rather than a fixed state. He had charm in the genuine sense, not performed warmth but actual facility with people, the kind that made strangers feel immediately at ease and that made rooms respond to him in the way that rooms responded to people who had that quality. He had gone to Indiana University for business and had done well there in the way he did well at everything, which was through the combination of his social intelligence and a genuine analytical capability that he deployed when he needed to, and set aside when deploying it was unnecessary. He had graduated in 2015 and moved to Chicago for a job at a mid-size product development consulting firm, where his combination of business skills and the design literacy he had absorbed growing up made him a useful bridge between the design teams and the client-facing side of the business. I had gone to the Rhode Island School of Design. My father had told me when I was 16 that I had something specific, and that the specific thing needed the right environment to develop into what it could become. He said the right environment for the kind of design thinking he observed in me was not a state school with a good design program. It was the best design school available, and the best design school available in the United States was in Providence, Rhode Island. He said we would make the finances work. My mother looked at him when he said this and then looked at me and said, "He's right." RISD was the 4 years that defined what I was going to do professionally, not because of what was taught there, though what was taught was excellent. Because of the specific culture of a place where design was treated as a genuine intellectual discipline rather than an applied skill, where the conversations about what a designed object meant and why it worked were as rigorous as the conversations about how it was made, and where I was surrounded for the first time by people who were serious about the same things I was serious about in a way that I had not previously encountered. I graduated in 2015, the same year Darius graduated from Indiana. We had a double celebration dinner in Indianapolis that summer that my parents had organized, and that had the warm quality of a family gathering that was genuinely celebratory rather than performative. Darius had said something at dinner that I had filed as characteristic, but had not thought about carefully until much later. He had said, "Zara and I are going to do something together eventually. She has the vision and I have the room." Everyone had laughed. My mother had said that sounded like a good partnership. I had smiled. I moved to Chicago 6 months after graduation for a position at a product design firm called Atlas Studio. The position was a junior designer role, but Atlas was considered one of the 3 best product design firms in Chicago, and the junior title was the standard entry point regardless of your background. I spent 3 years at Atlas learning how a serious design practice operated at the professional level, the relationship between client work and internal development, the specific economics of a design firm, the way intellectual property was managed in an environment where the work that left the studio represented the firm's competitive value, and the management of that value was taken seriously in ways that I internalized, and then, later, did not apply carefully enough in my own situation. I left Atlas in 2018 to work independently, not because Atlas was not a good environment, it was excellent. Because I had an idea that I had been developing in the margins of my Atlas work for 18 months, and that I believed required my full attention rather than the fraction of it I could give it while managing client work for someone else. The idea was a product design system for modular residential furniture that addressed a specific problem I had identified through my own experience of furnishing a series of small Chicago apartments and through conversations with dozens of people in similar situations. The problem was the gap between what flat pack and modular furniture offered, affordability, adaptability, self-assembly, and what the design quality of those products delivered. The dominant flat pack solutions were functional but aesthetically limited in a way that had always frustrated me as a designer, and the high-quality modular alternatives that existed were priced for a consumer who was not the consumer most likely to need modular and adaptable furniture, which was the consumer living in urban rental housing who was moving every 2 to 3 years, and who needed quality and adaptability at a price point that matched the reality of their situation. The design system I was developing addressed this gap through a component architecture that I had spent 14 months developing from the initial concept through to the detailed specifications that allowed the system to be manufactured at the cost point the target market required without sacrificing the design quality that would make the product worth choosing over the existing options. I called the system Modular M. It was the best work I had done. I knew it was the best work I had done in the specific way that designers knew when they had found the thing they were building toward, which was that the work felt inevitable from the inside rather than constructed. My brother was in Chicago. We were close in the way of siblings who are in the same city and who genuinely liked each other under the sibling history. Dinner every few weeks, calls in between, the specific texture of an adult sibling relationship that functioned on regular ordinary contact rather than the formal contact of holidays and family emergencies. I had been telling him about Modular M for months, not the full technical detail. He was not a product designer, and the full technical detail would not have been meaningful to him in that form. But the concept, the market thesis, the problem it was solving. He was a good listener when he was interested, and he was clearly interested in this. He asked smart questions about the market and the competitive landscape and the go-to-market approach that reflected his business training and were genuinely useful in some cases because they pushed me to think through aspects of the commercial picture that I was less naturally focused on. I had trusted him. This is where I have to be specific about the error in order for the story to be fully honest. I showed Darius the complete design specification for Modular M in October of the 14th month of development. I showed him because I was proud of it, and I trusted him, and I wanted a reaction from someone I trusted. I showed him on my laptop in his apartment over dinner. I walked him through the entire specification, the component architecture, the manufacturing parameters, the material specifications, the assembly system, the cost model. The provisional patent application was on the same laptop, 90% complete. I had been working on it for 2 months and had been telling myself I would finish it and file it for 6 weeks. I did not finish it and file it that evening. I showed my brother the work and I left. He made 3 meetings with Halcyon Product Group over the following 11 days. I did not know about any of them. Sandra Reeves practiced intellectual property law from an office on the 18th floor of a building in the Loop that had the specific quality of a firm that was serious and not interested in communicating that seriousness through anything other than the quality of its work. Her office had 1 window, good light, and a wall of bookshelves that held more paper than most law offices that age would have had, which told me she was the kind of attorney who kept things in physical form, because physical form was more reliable in certain evidentiary situations. She had been practicing IP law for 21 years, specifically in the product design and manufacturing space, which meant she had handled every version of the situation I was describing, and several versions I probably had not thought of. She listened to the full account of the Modular M development timeline and Darius's meetings with Halcyon and the phone call on the Friday morning. She did not interrupt. She did not ask clarifying questions until I finished. When I finished, she was quiet for approximately 10 seconds, and then she said 3 things. The first thing was that the provisional patent I had filed that Friday afternoon was the most important thing I had done, and that the 14 months of dated cloud storage files were the evidentiary foundation of everything that followed. The second thing was that Halcyon Product Group was the party with the deepest pockets in this situation, and that the most strategically significant question was what they had known when they entered the licensing agreement with Darius. If they had purchased a license from someone who had misrepresented his ownership of the design, the question of their liability was different from the question of their liability if they had conducted due diligence and been shown information designed to obscure the actual creator. The third thing was that the case was strong but the strength of the case depended on what the discovery process produced, and that she would need time to build the foundation before the full picture was clear. She took the case. The filing of the formal IP infringement claim took 6 weeks. Sandra and her team spent those 6 weeks building the evidentiary package, the complete creation timeline, the provisional patent application, the 14 months of dated design files, and a forensic analysis of the metadata on every file that established the creation dates independently of the cloud storage timestamps, which were accurate but could be challenged on authenticity grounds and needed the independent confirmation. The forensic analysis produced something Sandra had not expected, and that changed the picture of the case significantly. The Modular M design files I had created across 14 months of development included, in the metadata, a record of every device that had accessed any file and every time a file had been opened. Darius's laptop had accessed the design files on 4 separate occasions in the 2 weeks between the dinner at his apartment and his first meeting with Halcyon. He had a copy of my complete specification on his device before any of the Halcyon meetings. Sandra said when the forensic report came back, he didn't just show them the concept. He showed them your specification, the exact file. I said, can we prove that's what he showed them? She said, we can prove he accessed the files. What he did with them is something the discovery process will establish. But the fact that he had your complete specification on his device before the first Halcyon meeting is significant for establishing intent. The complaint was filed in the Northern District of Illinois. The defendants were listed as Darius Coleman and Halcyon Product Group. The claims were patent infringement, misappropriation of trade secrets, and unjust enrichment. Halcyon received the complaint through their registered agent on a Thursday morning. Their general counsel called Sandra that afternoon. The call was professional and brief. The general counsel said Halcyon took IP claims seriously and would cooperate with the discovery process, and that they were reviewing the situation internally. She said nothing that conceded anything. She said everything that communicated that Halcyon was not planning to be in a legal fight about this longer than necessary. Sandra told me after the call, they know they have a problem. The question is whether their problem is that they licensed a design without proper due diligence, or whether their problem is that they knew the design had a creator who was not your brother and they licensed it anyway. Those are different problems with different price tags. I said, what does the discovery tell us? She said, that's what discovery is for. Darius called me 2 days after the complaint was served. He said, Zara, this is not how to handle this. I said, hello, Darius. He said, I told you I was going to make it right. I was working on that. You filing a lawsuit before I had a chance to work on it is. I said, you had a chance to make it right from the moment you deposited $1 million in your account for a design you did not create. That was 6 weeks ago. You bought a car. He said, Zara. I said, you need to talk to an attorney, Darius. Sandra's firm will communicate through the formal channels going forward. He said, you're serious about this? I said, I filed a federal complaint. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that car cost me $200,000. I said, I know. He said, Zara. I said, talk to an attorney, Darius. I hung up. He hired an attorney in the second week after the filing. The attorney was competent and experienced and made the standard initial filing responses and discovery objections that experienced attorneys made. The responses did not change the fundamental picture of the case, which was that the evidentiary foundation I had built across 14 months of dated, metadata-confirmed design files was the kind of foundation that was difficult to argue against on the merits. What the discovery process produced over the following 4 months was the full picture of what Darius had done and what Halcyon had known. Discovery in an intellectual property case had a specific quality that I had not fully understood before I was inside one, which was that it was primarily a document review process, and that the documents tended to produce a picture that was more complete and more specific than the narrative either party had available before the documents were reviewed. The Halcyon documents were were the most significant. Sandra's team filed discovery requests for all communications between Halcyon and Darius Coleman related to the Modular M design. All due diligence materials Halcyon had collected prior to entering the licensing agreement. All internal communications at Halcyon related to the design and the licensing decision, and all communications between Halcyon and any third party related to the design's provenance. Halcyon produced the documents. What the documents showed was the specific sequence of the 3 meetings between Darius and Halcyon's product development team and what had been presented at each meeting. The first meeting was conceptual. Darius had presented the market thesis and the problem the design addressed. The second meeting was substantive. Darius had presented the full design specification, which was my specification from my files, formatted with his name on the cover sheet. The third meeting was the commercial negotiation that had produced the licensing agreement. The documents also showed something that Sandra read carefully and then called me about on a Tuesday evening. She said, "There is an email chain between Halcyon's product development director and their general counsel from between the second and third meeting." I said, "What does it say?" She said, "The product development director sent the general counsel a note flagging that the specification they had been shown had certain metadata characteristics that suggested it had been created in a software environment and over a development timeline that was inconsistent with what Coleman had described about his process." The general counsel responded asking what that meant practically. The product development director said it meant either the creator was not who he said it was, or he had used a tool that logged creation dates differently. I said, "They knew." She said, "They had a question. The question was documented, and the licensing agreement was signed 3 days after the general counsel responded to that email." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "They signed the agreement knowing they had a question about provenance." Sandra said, "Their general counsel told the product development director to let the contract team handle the standard IP warranties and representations. The contract includes a representation from Coleman that he was the creator of the work. They let the contractual representation substitute for resolving the provenance question." I said, "Which means they are either negligent or they made a deliberate choice to proceed with a known question unresolved." Sandra said, "The distinction between those two things is going to matter for the damages calculation." The damages calculation was the next phase of the work Sandra and her team built after the discovery documents were reviewed. Patent infringement damages in the United States included the actual damages suffered by the patent holder. In this case, the $1 million licensing fee that should have been paid to me rather than to Darius, and potentially enhanced damages if willful infringement could be established. The internal Halcyon email chain was the document that most directly supported the willful infringement argument. A company that signed a licensing agreement 3 days after their own product development director raised a documented question about the creator's identity, and that responded to that question by deferring to contractual warranties rather than resolving the underlying question, was a company that had made a choice about risk management. Sandra's brief argued that the choice was willful in the legal sense because the risk being managed was the risk that the licensing agreement was being signed with someone who had not created the work. Darius's attorney filed a response arguing that the metadata question had been an internal technical discussion that Halcyon's team had resolved to their satisfaction through the contractual representation. The response also argued that Darius had made a genuine contribution to the design through the market positioning and client development work that had produced the Halcyon relationship, and that his contribution was substantial enough to support his ownership claim. The contribution argument was the one that required the most careful response because it was the argument with the most surface plausibility. Darius had, in fact, introduced the design to Halcyon and had developed the commercial relationship. If his attorney could establish that this contribution was sufficient to establish co-ownership, the case became significantly more complicated. Sandra addressed this in the response brief with the specific precision of someone who had spent 21 years in this exact territory. She argued that commercial contribution and creative contribution were distinct categories in intellectual property law, and that the introduction of a design to a potential licensee through an existing relationship was a commercial service rather than a creative contribution to the design itself. She cited the 14-month creation timeline, the complete absence of any documented contribution by Darius to any element of the design's technical specification, and the forensic evidence showing that Darius had accessed my files after the dinner at his apartment and had presented my specification with his name on the cover sheet as the entirety of his creative contribution to the Halcyon meetings. She also filed a motion to compel the deposition of Halcyon's product development director, specifically on the question of what the metadata concern in the email chain had meant to her and how it had been resolved internally. The deposition happened 6 months after the original filing. The product development director, a woman named Christine Park, who had been at Halcyon for 9 years and who clearly understood the position the email chain had put her in, answered questions with the careful precision of someone who had been very thoroughly prepared by her company's legal team. She confirmed that the metadata question had been her concern and that she had raised it with the general counsel and that she had not been involved in the decision to proceed with the licensing agreement. Sandra asked her one question that the preparation had not fully addressed. She said, "At the time you raised the metadata concern, did you have a resolution to that concern?" Christine Park said, "I raised the question." Sandra said, "Did you have a resolution?" A pause. Christine Park said, "The general counsel responded." Sandra said, "Did the general counsel's response resolve your concern about the creator's identity?" Another pause. Christine Park said, "I understood we were proceeding with the licensing agreement." Sandra said, "I'm asking whether your concern about the creator's identity was resolved before the agreement was signed." Christine Park said, "I was not involved in the final decision." Sandra said, "Thank you." She looked at me across the conference room table when Christine Park and her attorney had left. She said, "The deposition established that the concern was not resolved. It was set aside. That's the distinction we needed." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we talk to Halcyon about settlement." The settlement conversation with Halcyon began 3 weeks after Christine Park's deposition. Their general counsel called Sandra directly. The call was 30 minutes and resulted in a scheduled mediation session at a neutral location in Chicago. Sandra said afterward that the fact that they had called directly and proposed mediation within 3 weeks of the deposition meant they had made their internal assessment of the litigation risk and had determined that proceeding to trial was not in their interest. The mediation was a full-day session. I was present. I was not the one doing the talking, which was appropriate. Sandra was the one doing the talking, and she was very good at it. But being present was important for a reason Sandra had explained to me before we went in. She said, "You are the creator of this work. Halcyon's team needs to understand that the person on the other side of this table is the actual designer of the product they licensed, not a legal abstraction. Your presence communicates that." I sat at the table, and I was present in the way she had described, and I let her do the talking. What Sandra communicated across the full-day session was the following. The evidentiary position supporting the infringement claim was strong and had been strengthened by the discovery process. The deposition of Christine Park had established a documented record of Halcyon's awareness of a provenance concern that had not been resolved before the licensing agreement was signed. The enhanced damages argument for willful infringement was supportable on the basis of that record. The litigation path, if Halcyon chose to proceed, would produce a public record of those documents. She also communicated what we were prepared to accept in settlement, which was the full value of the licensing fee, appropriate attribution of the design to me as its creator, a licensing correction that put my name on the agreement going forward, and recovery of the legal costs of the infringement action. Halcyon's team caucused 3 times during the day. By 4 in the afternoon, they had made a counteroffer. The counteroffer was lower than what Sandra had asked for, She responded with a number between her opening position and their counter. They caucused again. They came back with a number that was within the range of what we had discussed as acceptable before the mediation. Sandra looked at me. I said, yes. The settlement agreement was drafted over the following 2 weeks and signed at the end of the month. The settlement amount was $1,200,000, which was the original licensing fee plus the legal costs and a premium that reflected the willfulness argument without litigating it to a verdict. The licensing agreement was amended to attribute the Modular M design to me as creator. The amended agreement included my name on all future commercial materials related to the product. And Halcyon agreed to a separate licensing arrangement with me directly for the ongoing use of the design going forward, which was an arrangement that Sandra had negotiated as part of the settlement because the design had by that point been integrated into Halcyon's product line in a way that made disentangling it more costly to them than licensing it properly. The Halcyon piece of the settlement was complete. The Darius piece was separate. Darius's attorney had been in communication with Sandra throughout the mediation process with a parallel negotiation about the claim against Darius specifically. The claim against Darius was for unjust enrichment and breach of the implied duty not to misappropriate a family member's intellectual property, which was a cause of action that was less standard than the patent infringement claim, but was supported by the documented facts of what he had done with the files he had accessed after the dinner. Darius's financial position, by the time the settlement with Halcyon was being finalized, was different from his financial position 6 months earlier when he had signed the licensing agreement. The $1 million that had cleared his account had not been managed conservatively. The Porsche had been $200,000. The apartment upgrade had been another significant expenditure. The months of what appeared from the outside to be the specific spending pattern of someone who had received a large amount of money and had treated it as a permanent state rather than a one-time event. His attorney communicated to Sandra that his liquid assets were substantially below the amount of the claim against him. Sandra said, "He spent it." I said, "I know." She said, "The judgment is still collectible against current assets and future earnings. The question is how aggressively you want to pursue collection." I said, "What are his current assets?" She said, "The car is the most significant liquid asset. There is also a brokerage account with a balance that is not substantial, and the contents of the apartment which have no significant value." I said, "File for the judgment." She filed. The judgment came through on the standard timeline. It established that Darius owed the amount of the claim to me. The judgment was collectible against his assets. The first thing the collection process reached was the Porsche. The tow truck arrived on a Tuesday morning. Sandra called me when it happened because she had been tracking the collection timeline and knew when the asset seizure was scheduled. She said, "The car is being collected this morning." I said, "Is he there?" She said, "The address of record is his apartment. He would typically be notified." I did not go there. I was not going to drive to my brother's apartment to watch his car get towed. That was not the version of this I was interested in being present for. But Sandra's process server, who was at the address to serve related documentation and who had no instructions about what to observe, sent Sandra a brief text afterward that said the subject had been on the porch when the vehicle was collected. Sandra told me this matter-of-factly in our afternoon call. I said, "How did he look?" She said, "The process server said he was very still." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Okay." The 6 months after the settlement had a specific quality that I want to describe accurately, because this is the part of the story that most needed to not be what people expected it to be. I had the money. The Halcyon settlement had cleared. The Darius judgment was being collected incrementally against his remaining assets and future earnings through a payment structure his attorney had negotiated, because a judgment without a payment structure was a number on paper rather than a recovery in practice. The attribution of the Modular M design had been corrected. My name was on the amended licensing agreement, and on every commercial product that Halcyon produced from the design going forward. The things that needed to be established were established. What I did with that was go back to work. The Modular M design was licensed to Halcyon and generating royalty income. The design was also available to me for development in markets and applications that did not conflict with the Halcyon territory, which Sandra had been careful to negotiate into the settlement terms. I had been thinking about the next phase of the system, a commercial hospitality version that addressed the same modular and adaptable principles for hotel room and short-term rental furnishing for the better part of the previous year, and had begun the development work in earnest once the settlement was finalized. The hospitality version was called Modular H. I worked on it alone. I filed the patent application before I showed it to anyone. This is not a principle I had to remind myself of. It had become the default orientation of my creative process in a way that would not require reminding. My father called me the week after the settlement closed. He said, "I'm proud of how you handled this." He said it with the specific directness of a man who weighed words carefully and who said things like that because he meant them. I said, "I just did what Sandra said to do." He said, "You also did what you should have done with the patent application before you showed anyone the design." I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "Learning from something that cost you is how learning was supposed to work." I said, "It cost less than it could have." He said, "Yes, because you finished the application the day he called you." My mother had not said much about any of it while it was happening. She had said at the beginning that she was sorry and that this was not how she had raised either of us to behave and that she hoped it could be resolved. She had said at the end, when I called to tell her the settlement was final, that she was glad and that she loved me. She had not said anything about Darius in either conversation, and I had not pressed the question because the question of what my parents were doing with their relationship with Darius was not mine to manage. Darius called me 3 months after the settlement. He did not call to apologize in the formal sense. He called to talk. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking and that the thinking had been uncomfortable and that he had come to understand some things about what he had done and about himself that he had not understood while he was doing it. He said the specific thing that was most honest, which was that he had told himself a story about the collaboration and the market positioning that had made the licensing agreement feel like a legitimate commercial transaction rather than what it had been, which was the sale of someone else's work. He said he had known the story was not fully true and had told it to himself anyway because the money had been real, and the story had been the thing that made taking it possible. I said, "I know." He said, "You knew while I was still telling it to myself." I said, "I knew when you called me on Friday morning and explained why it was reasonable." He said, "The Friday call, I had practiced that." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry, Zara." I said, "I know." I said, "Darius, the question for us is not what happened. We both know what happened. The question is whether there is a version of us that exists on the other side of it." He said, "I want there to be." I said, "That's not sufficient. Wanting is not enough. Wanting is where you start. What happens after wanting is what tells me whether there is a version of us." He said, "What do you need?" I thought about that. I said, "Time, and the specific evidence that what you said in the Friday call was the exception rather than the expression of who you are." He said, "How do I show that?" I said, "By being the person I grew up with for long enough that the Friday call becomes a thing you did rather than a thing you are. I can't tell you how long that takes. I don't know." He said, "Okay." He said, "I'm still paying the judgment, every month." I said, "I know." He said, "That's fair." I said, "Yes." We ended the call without making specific plans and without resolving anything beyond the conversation itself, which was the right amount of resolution for where we were. The relationship would either become something real on the other side of what had happened, or it would not, and the determination of that was going to take a form of time and evidence that could not be compressed. Modular H went into development in full that fall. The patent was filed in the 3rd month of development. My father sent me an email when I told him I had filed. The email said, "That's my girl." 3 words, the right 3. Chicago in November had the quality of a city that had made peace with what winter was going to require and was getting on with it. The lake was the specific dark gray of late autumn, the wind off the water doing what Chicago wind did, which was remind you that it was there regardless of what you had planned for the day. I was at my desk on a Tuesday morning with the Modular H specification open and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, because the specification was at the stage where the details were the thing. And the details required the kind of attention that made coffee go cold without you noticing. The royalty statement from Halcyon had arrived the previous week. The Modular M design was in production and performing in the market. The royalty was real and arrived on schedule because the amended licensing agreement had terms that required it to be real, and on schedule, and Sandra had made sure the terms were clear. My father's office had called me about a residential project he was developing in Indianapolis that had a furnishing component. He said he had shown my work to the clients and that they were interested in a conversation about whether Modular M had an application in their project. I said I would come to Indianapolis for the conversation. He said he thought that was right. The judgment against Darius was current. His attorney sent a payment confirmation every month and Sandra's office confirmed receipt. It would take several years to complete at the payment structure they had negotiated. That was the timeline, and the timeline was what it was. My brother and I had spoken twice since the post-settlement call. Brief calls, not about anything specific, one about our parents, one about nothing in particular. Both had been the length and warmth of 2 people who were finding out whether there was still something there to find. I did not know yet what the answer was. I was finding out. Here is what I want to say before this story ends. The Modular M design existed because I spent 14 months building it. The filing of the provisional patent on the Friday afternoon after the Friday morning phone call was the most important thing I did in those 14 months. Not because the patent made the design valuable. The design made the design valuable. But because the patent made the design mine in the form that law recognized and that law could protect. The lesson was not that you should not trust people. The lesson was that trust and documentation were not alternatives. You could trust someone completely and still file the patent application before you showed them the work. One was a statement about the relationship. The other was the protection of something that the relationship, however real, could not protect on its own. My father had managed client relationships in his architecture practice for 30 years with the same combination, genuine investment in the relationship and complete documentation of the work and the ownership of the work. He had told me this once when I was at RISD and had treated it as professional advice that I had understood abstractly. I understood it concretely now. If this story meant something to you today, please hit that like button, leave a comment, and share it with a creative person in your life who needs to hear the specific lesson about documentation. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Every story here is this complete. Take care of your work and file the patent. See you next time.